One of the hardest part about learning endgames is the Rook and Queen endgames. So in this series, I'll be going over basic Rook and Queen endgame principles that you can learn as a beginner of chess so that you can convert more of your Rook and Queen endgames while playing chess. So we're gonna start off with a Rook versus one pawn endgame here. And usually when you have the Rook in these situations, you are going to win this as long as the King is close enough to the pawn, but you're not going to lose at this point. I mean, you'd be really bad if you actually lost the Rook and pawn endgame. So in this position, it is Black's turn to move. We can see here that the White King is pretty far away from this pawn, and that this Rook is kind of eyeing this pawn as it marches down the side of the board. So what White needs to do is it needs to get this King as close as it can to that pawn, so that when that King approaches it, the Rook can take it and have the King backing up and winning the game. In this position here, Black to move, they just move the pawn closer to the King. The King is now able to defend the pawn, and the Rook can't just stop this itself without causing a draw. So White needs to get its King into the game, and it goes F3 here, just trying to get as close as we can to the promotion square. Black continues to push that pawn up, and the King gets even closer to the pawn, and Black puts that King in opposition. So what is Black to do here is they throw a check, because now that the King can't go here or here, they have to move in front of the pawn, which Black does, and you move that King closer if you're White. Now here, Black moves over here, trying to, push this pawn. The King, one, getting closer, and two, leading to a Rook check that's going to have to force the King either in front of the pawn or not. So White moves the King here, and the King is now right next to the pawn, so we just need to get the Rook in position to trade off this pawn here. So after pushing, the Rook pushes, and you have to move the King in front of the pawn, which then you move here, and now the King and the pawn are lined up ready to take this and win the game. Black, though, if you're in this position where you have a knight pawn here and you have the Rook or the pawn, something to note is the King comes over here to A1, a last ditch attempt at getting a draw, because if you just are careless and you take the pawn here, oh look, it's a draw, the King has no squares to go to. So what you need to do here is you just need to move the King one more time. So you have to queen and you take, and you still lose the game because the King has to come back here. You just bring it back, and then you just try to get opposition and get your Rook checkmate there. So those are the main principles of a Rook and one pawn endgame, that if you have the pawn, just try to get the King next to the pawn and get it to promotion. And if you have the Rook, make sure that King gets next to the pawn so that you're able to get the pawn and win the game. So there is another Rook and one pawn endgame that I think is important to note, and that is when the pawn is not even really close to promotion. The King's next to the pawn, but it really can't move it forward. How do you best stop the advancement of that pawn? And so we can see here in this position, you have the King and the Rook on the far back rank, and you have the King that's trying to escort this pawn up the board. So with White to move here, White just does the simple Rook to B5. It cuts off this King. This King, because you have a Rook pawn here, this King can never get behind this pawn and just move over on the other side of the pawn. And so he will always be forever stuck on these three ranks, basically. So you can only push the pawn in this position. So that's what Black does. He tries pushing. You just bring the King closer, trying to get it to the promotion square. And at a certain point, you're going to have an issue where the pawn is getting really close to promotion, and you need to be smart about it. It's on the third rank here, so what you need to do is you need to go Rook to B3, attacking this pawn. Now the King can't get here because you're going to take, and you can't push because you have Rook to H3 here, winning the pawn. The King's too far away, and you're going to win the game. So that's one thing to note when you have a Rook pawn against one Rook, and they're pretty far enough back, is you just cut the King off. Usually a smart principle is to cut the King from the support of its pizzas, and then you can easily win the game there. Now the last of kind of these basic pawn and Rook endgames is a Rook versus two pawns here, and we have in this position here is White is pushing these pretty close up to promotion, and usually when you have two pawns, it becomes very difficult to stop if you just have a single Rook, just because the connected pawns can play with each other, and the Rook can't really stop both of them at the same time, especially when they're this advanced up the board. So what do you do as Black in this situation is you go and attack this lead pawn. So what happens is this pawn can't push forward without dropping this pawn here, and so what White does is they try to bring the King into the action here while trying to cut off this Black King. This Black King can't go directly there, so he's going to try to obviously get up and get closer to the pawns, but he still can't move these pawns up. So what he does is he moves closer to this pawn here, and you bring the King closer, and that's just basically what you need to do in these Rook and pawn endgames. And now that this pawn is protected by this King, you can push this pawn up. So what Black does is they push the Rook here, and the King comes here. And White does this really interesting King here move, which you think that wouldn't be great, but no matter what the Rook plays, you just push the pawn up. If the Rook comes here, you just push this pawn up. It's supported by this pawn. If he moves here, you push this here. What you're doing is you're trying to cut off this King from getting into the help of the Rook. So this Rook comes after this pawn, and you just push that pawn up. The King is just trying to get over here to there. There's opposition with the White King there. And now he does this really weird king to c6 move, which is the only thing that really wins in this position. Because if he was to go king to e6 here, what happens is king to e4, king to f7, and you have a complete draw here because if the king comes up here, you can't promote this pawn because if you do, the rook takes, you take, and then you get a draw here. And then if you do go f7 thinking, oh, he's just gonna take here and I'm gonna get my queen, like obviously that's winning for white, but what happens is when we're in this position, you push forward here and then you get the check here. The king is now in check, king goes king e7, the rook takes, and now the pawn is pinned to the king, and you have a draw. And so white doesn't win here. So normally white wins with the 2 pawns there, but you have to be smart with your king position here. So in this position, king goes c6 here. The king brings it back to opposition because that's the only thing you can do. The king then gets closer to its pawns. And by this time, it's a little too late for black. And black uses his last resource over here to get to a1 here, checking the king, which would be a checkmate if you were to like, promote to a queen here, right? Or any of these. So what white does here is they actually under-promote to a knight, putting the king in check. The king has to move, and then you can promote to a queen, so that when this check comes, you can just get out of here. Then the knight is supported by the queen, and white's able to win. So those are the basic principles of rook and pawn endgames. In our next video, which is going to be here, we're going to be looking at rook and pawn versus rook endgames, and we'll see you then.